The summer of 1944, Normandy, France. The air inside the sunken lanes of the French countryside was stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp earth and cow manure. For the men of the German Wehrmacht, however, the atmosphere carried a different weight, a crushing, suffocating dread that had nothing to do with humidity. A German infantryman, a veteran who had survived the freezing hell of the Eastern Front, later wrote in his memoirs about a new breed of fear that had taken root in the West. His unit was on the march, moving up to reinforce the crumbling defenses along the coast. They walked in single file along the narrow roads, flanked on both sides by the bocage, those ancient, thick hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress and every road into a tunnel. The morning sky was a bruised shade of grey, hanging low over the fields. It was the kind of overcast weather that usually offered a reprieve, a blanket of safety that kept the Allied air forces grounded, or so they thought. Suddenly, the air pressure seemed to drop. A low guttural rumble began to vibrate through the soles of their boots, distinct from the clanking of tank treads or the distant thud of artillery. It grew louder, transforming into a terrifying mechanical roar that seemed to tear the sky apart. The thunderbolts dropped from the clouds. There was no warning, no air raid siren, just the sudden, violently loud scream of massive radial engines at full throttle. There was no time to scatter, no time to dig in. The only option was to dive face first into the muddy ditches and pray to a god who seemed to have abandoned Normandy. The world erupted. The sound was deafening, rhythmic, jackhammer pounding that drowned out even the engine noise. The ground churned and exploded as if boiled by an invisible hand. Men who had stood resolute against Soviet T-34 tanks at Kursk, men who had endured artillery barrages that turned the earth into a moonscape, now curled into fetal balls, weeping, their hands clawing at the dirt. They had seen friends die in ways that defied description. But nothing, absolutely nothing, in 4 years of total war had prepared them for the violence of the American P-47 Thunderbolt. In those chaotic, blood-soaked seconds, a realization swept through the German ranks, a cold certainty that would break the Wehrmacht's spine. The war in the West was already lost, as the lead aircraft rolled inverted and pulled into a steep Predator's dive. The sheer size of the machine became terrifyingly apparent. The cowling of its massive engine seemed wide enough to swallow a man whole. Its elliptical wings were heavy with bombs and high-velocity rockets. To the German soldiers cowering in the mud, it looked less like an airplane and more like a falling building. They knew this silhouette well. They called them jobbos, short for Jagdbomber or fighter bomber. But this specific machine, this gargantuan metal beast, had earned a reputation that bordered on the mythological. It was a terror weapon. But here is the irony of history. Nobody, not the Americans, and certainly not the Germans, ever expected the Thunderbolt to become the angel of death for the German army. In fact, when the Luftwaffe first encountered this aircraft in the skies over Western Europe in April 1943, they didn't fear it. They laughed at it. High above the Channel, seasoned Luftwaffe pilots, flying sleek Messerschmitt Bf-19s and deadly Focke-Wulf 190s, spotted the new American fighters approaching at 25,000 feet. They keyed their radios, their voices dripping with amusement. Look, they joked to their wingman. The Americans are flying bathtubs. To the German aesthetic, obsessed with lethal agility and slender aerodynamics, the P-47 looked ridiculous. It was a monstrosity. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, empty, almost twice the weight of a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt. Its fuselage was so bulbous, so deep and wide, that American pilots joked it looked like a milk jug. The name stuck. To the men who flew her, she would always be the Jug. The Germans mocked its profile, calling it the Razorback because of the sharp ridge behind the cockpit canopy. Even the American pilots, standing on the tarmac for the first time next to this Leviathan, scratched their heads. They wondered what the brass was thinking. They were fighter pilots, meant to be the cavalry of the sky, strapped into nimble steeds. Instead, they were being asked to fly a tank. It seemed like a design by committee, a clumsy beast that would be eaten alive in the Darwinian struggle of aerial combat, where speed and turn radius meant the difference between a drink at the officers' club and a telegram to your mother. And initially, the critics seemed right. In the early clashes over France, the Thunderbolt's performance was whelmingly mediocre. It couldn't turn inside the German fighters. It climbed sluggishly. It felt heavy, ungainly, and out of its element. But the skeptics didn't understand the mind of the man who built it. The Thunderbolt was the brainchild of Alexander Kartveli. Born Alexander Kartvelishvili in Tbilisi, Georgia, in 1896, he was a man displaced by revolution. He had fled the Bolshevik occupation of his homeland, studying aviation in Paris, before eventually landing at Republic Aviation on Long Island. New York, Kartveli was a genius, but he was a pragmatic one. He understood the changing nature of war better than the generals did. He wasn't interested in the romantic notion of the dogfight, the graceful aerial ballet of the First World War. He was building a weapon for industrial warfare. He didn't want elegance. He wanted brutality. He wanted endurance. He wanted a machine that could fly into the heart of hell, deliver a sledgehammer blow, and bring its pilot home when any other plane would have been reduced to scrap metal. The heart of his design was the engine. Kartveli wrapped the entire airframe around the Pratt & Whitney R280A Double Wasp. This was an 18-cylinder radial monster, an engineering marvel that churned out over 2,000 horsepower. It was the size of a small car and weighed over 2,500 pounds on its own. But a big engine wasn't enough. Kartveli needed this beast to breathe in the thin air of the stratosphere, to escort American bombers high above the flak. So, he installed a turbo supercharger system complex, labyrinthine network of ducts and pipes that ran from the engine in the nose all the way to the turbine in the tail, and back again. It added weight. It added complexity. But it meant that above 20,000 feet, where other fighters were gasping for air, the Thunderbolt was just getting started. Then he armed it. And he did so with a ferocity that bordered on excess, while other nations were fiddling with mixtures of light, machine guns and low-capacity cannons. Kartveli installed 8.50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns, 4 in each wing. They carried a combined total of 3,400 rounds of ammunition when a pilot squeezed the trigger. All 8 guns roared to life simultaneously. The physics of the recoil alone was enough to slow the aircraft in mid-air. They could spit out 100 rounds every single second into a convergence zone 6 feet wide. This wasn't just shooting. It was disintegration. A 3-second burst, just a heartbeat of time, put enough lead in the air to saw a German fighter in half. It could turn a truck into a burning skeleton or vaporize an infantry squad. No other single-engine fighter in the world packed that kind of kinetic punch. When Kartveli unveiled his creation, the skeptics asked if such a massive dinosaur could actually fight. Kartveli, the quiet Georgian exile, purportedly smiled. "It will be a dinosaur," he said. "But it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." The prototype, the XP-47B, took to the skies on May 6, 1941. The test pilot, Lowry Brown, had to make an emergency landing with the cockpit filling with smoke, but he climbed out beaming. "We hit the jackpot," he declared. The beast was fast. In a dive, it felt like it was breaking the laws of physics. But potential is one thing. Combat is another. The first Thunderbolts arrived in England in January 1943. Delivered to the 56th Fighter Group, this unit would become legendary as Zemsk's Wolfpack, named after their stern, methodical commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Hub Zemp. The transition was not smooth. The pilots were coming from British Spitfires, beautiful aircraft that you wore like a tailored suit. The P-47 felt like driving a bus. In mock dogfights, the RAF Spitfire pilots flew circles around the Americans. They humiliated the Thunderbolts so thoroughly that the commanders eventually banned the practice fights because it was destroying the morale of the American pilots. The men sat in their briefing rooms, sullen and angry. They felt they had been handed a death sentence. "How are we supposed to fight the Luftwaffe in this?" one pilot asked. "We can't turn. We can't climb. We're sitting ducks." But Hub Zemk was a thinker. He had observed the Battle of Britain from the ground in 1940. He had watched the RAF bleed. He realized that the problem wasn't the plane. The problem was the mindset. They were trying to fly the Thunderbolt like a Spitfire. They were trying to fence with a sledgehammer. Zemk threw out the old rulebook. The P-47 wasn't a dogfighter. It was an energy fighter. He drilled a new doctrine into his men. "Stay high," Zemk ordered. "Do not under any circumstances get into a turning fight with a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf. You will lose." Instead, they would use the Thunderbolt's strengths. Its weight was its weapon. From 25,000 feet, a pilot would roll over and dive. The 10,000-pound jug would drop like a stone, accelerating to speeds over 450, sometimes 500 miles per hour. It caught German pilots completely off guard. "Hit and run," Zemp preached. "Boom and zoom. You dive on the enemy. You unleash a torrent of .50 caliber fire that shreds his aircraft before he even knows you're there. And then this was the key: you use that massive momentum to zoom back up into the safety of the altitude, leaving the enemy far below. If the German turned to fight, you didn't follow. You simply climbed away, reset the board, and dropped on him again. It was a cold, calculated form of warfare. It wasn't about glory. It was about physics. On April 8, 1943, the Thunderbolt flew its first combat mission, a fighter sweep over the French coast. It was a bust. Radios failed. Nerves frayed. They aborted before seeing a single German cross in the sky. The critics back at headquarters nodded smugly. The jug was a failure, but the tide was about to turn. And it would turn on the back of a farm boy from Oklahoma. Second Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson was 23 years old. He had grown up in Lawton, looking at the endless Oklahoma sky and dreaming of flight ever since his father lifted him onto his shoulders to watch biplanes loop and roll at a dusty airfield show. He worked for $4 a week in a cabinet shop to pay for lessons. He was a natural stick-and-rudder man, but the army almost didn't let him fight. Johnson was a terrible shot. In gunnery training, he hit the towed target only 4% of the time. The minimum was 5%. Technically, he should have washed out. But the meat grinder of the air war needed bodies, and Johnson had grit. He talked his way into the cockpit. On June 26, 1943, Johnson was flying escort for B-17 bombers returning from a raid over northern France. The formation was tight, eyes scanning the sun. Then the ambush came. Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 26 the Abbeville boys. The elite of the Luftwaffe dropped out of the glare. They were invisible until the moment their cannons began to flash. Johnson's world disintegrated. 21 20mm explosive. Cannon shells slammed into his P-47. The sound was like being inside a steel drum, while someone beat on it with a sledgehammer. The fuselage was ripped open. The canopy shattered, showering him with plexiglass. Shrapnel sliced into his face and legs. Fire, the pilot's greatest fear, licked at the floorboards. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit, coating the shattered windscreen in an opaque, oily mess. The controls went mushy in his hands. The aircraft shuddered violently. Johnson, blinded by blood and fluid, fought to open the canopy. He had to bail out. He pulled the release handle. Nothing. The frame was twisted by the explosions. He was trapped. He was 20,000 feet over enemy territory, in a burning, crippled aircraft, with no radio and no way out. He was a dead man flying. Then a shadow pulled alongside him. It was a lone Focke-Wulf 190. The German pilot had already emptied his cannons into Johnson's plane. But he wasn't finished. He wanted the kill. He slid into position behind the crippled Thunderbolt and began to fire his machine guns. Johnson huddled behind a heavy armor plate that protected the pilot's seat. He listened to the bullets hammering against the metal behind his head. Clang, clang, clang. He squeezed into a ball, waiting for the one bullet that would find a gap. The German made a pass. The P-47 kept flying. The German circled and made another pass. Bullets shredded the tail. They punched holes in the wings. The big Pratt and Whitney engine coughed, choked, and sputtered, spitting oil and smoke. But it kept turning. The German pilot must have been screaming in frustration. He came around for a third pass. He poured lead into the American fighter. Still, the jug refused to die. Finally, the German pulled up alongside Johnson's wing. They were close enough to see each other's eyes. Johnson looked through his shattered canopy and saw the German pilot shaking his head. The Luftwaffe ace looked at the flying wrecker plane that by all laws of aerodynamics should have been a smoking hole in the French countryside, and he simply couldn't comprehend it. The German rocked his wings. A salute, a gesture of disbelief. He was out of ammunition. There was nothing left to do. He peeled away and vanished into the clouds. Robert Johnson nursed his shattered bird back across the English Channel. Every minute was an agony of suspense. The engine could seize. The tail could snap off. The fire could flare up. But the dinosaur kept flying. When he finally touched down at an emergency field in Manston, the ground crews stopped what they were doing and stared. They had never seen an airplane in this condition taxi under its own power. They counted over 200 bullet holes. There were gaping tears from cannon shells in the wings and fuselage. The rudder was hanging by a thread. The hydraulic system was gone. The electrical system was dead. One of the propeller blades was gouged. Several cylinders had been shot clean off the engine. It was a total write-off. It would never fly again. But Bob Johnson climbed out of the cockpit. He was bloody, he was shaken, but he was alive. He looked back at the machine that had brought him home. He realized then that Alexander Kartveli hadn't just built a plane. He had built a flying tank. Johnson would later say, "I owe my life to that dinosaur." He wasn't alone. Stories began to circulate through the mess halls. Pilots returning with tree branches stuck in their wings. Pilots landing with half a tail. Pilots whose engines had swallowed flak and kept running. The Germans, meanwhile, were learning a painful lesson. Ace Heinz Boer, a man with over 200 kills, warned his comrades, "The P-47 can absorb an astounding amount of lead. You have to be careful." The flying bathtub wasn't a joke anymore. It was a juggernaut. Bob Johnson healed up and went back to war. He flew 91 combat missions, all in the P-47. He shot down 27 German planes, becoming the first American to beat Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. He never lost faith in the Jug. But while the Thunderbolt was proving itself in the high-altitude arenas of the air war, a darker, grittier destiny awaited it. The plane that had been designed to escort bombers in the stratosphere was about to find its true calling down in the mud. It was March 1944. The invasion of Europe was looming. Major Glenn Duncan of the 353rd Fighter Group had an idea. Duncan was a Texan Ranger, aggressive and unconventional. He looked at the P-47 and saw something others missed. The same traits that made it tough to armor, the massive engine. The payload made it the perfect weapon for a different kind of fight. He went to his commanders. "Let us go down on the deck," he proposed. "Let us take the fight to the ground." It sounded suicidal. Fighter planes were delicate instruments. Taking them down to treetop level meant exposing them to every rifle, machine gun, and flak cannon in the German army. At 25,000 feet, you were a god. At 50 feet, you were a target. But Duncan was insistent. He gathered 16 volunteersmen who trusted him enough to risk everything. They loaded their wings with bombs and dropped down from the safety of the clouds. They roared across the French countryside at 350 miles per hour, skimming the hedgerows. They found trains. They found airfields. They found supply convoys, and they unleashed hell. What they discovered changed the war. The Thunderbolt's air-cooled engine didn't have a liquid cooling system like the P-51 Mustang or the Spitfire. If you put a bullet through the radiator of a Mustang, the engine seized in minutes. But the P-47, you could shoot a cylinder off and it would keep running. You could put a hole in the oil line and it would limp home. And the firepower, oh, the firepower. Those 8.50 caliber guns, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds, tore through locomotives like paper. They ignited fuel trucks. They cut down infantry. And now they could carry bombs. First, a 500-pounder under the belly. Then 1,000-pounders under the wings. Then came the rockets. The Holy Moses high-velocity aircraft rockets, 5 inches of solid propellant and high explosive. When a flight of 4 P-47s unleashed a salvo, it was like a destroyer firing a broadside dart. By the time the sun rose on June 6, 1944, the P-47 had evolved. It was no longer just an escort fighter. It was flying artillery. The 365th Fighter Group, known as the Hellhawks, were at the tip of the spear. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ray Stecker, briefed his men. The mission was simple and brutal. Kill anything that moves toward the beaches, first. Lieutenant John Fetzer sat in the cockpit of his Thunderbolt. Named the Madam, he remembered taking off into the inky blackness of the English night. As he crossed the channel, the sun began to bleed into the sky, revealing a sight that stopped his breath. Below him, the ocean was paved with ships, thousands of them, a bridge of steel connecting England to France. But as he crossed the coastline, the spectacle turned into a horror show. Flying at near treetop level over Omaha Beach, Fetzer looked down. The sand was littered with burning vehicles and motionless bodies. The surf was red. He saw American paratroopers, misdropped in the night, hanging lifeless from trees, swaying gently in the breeze. He saw gliders smashed into kindling against the stone walls of the HEDGR. It was a panorama of death, but there was movement inland. German Tiger tanks, massive, heavily armored beasts, rumbling down the roads toward the vulnerable beaches. If they broke through, they could push the fragile American landing force back into the sea. Captain Arlo Henry, the flight leader, a stocky man who chewed cigars and had ice water in his veins, didn't hesitate. He dipped his wing and led the flight down. The Thunderbolts screamed. The German tank crews looked up, likely terrified by the shape diving at them. The pilots held their triggers. The heavy machine guns chewed up the road. Bombs released, tumbling end over end. The explosions rocked the aircraft. When the smoke cleared, the Tigers were burning hulks. The counterattack was dead before it began. In the days and weeks that followed, the 365th moved to a forward airstrip in France, a patch of dirt carved out of a field near Azov. The war became intimate. There were no long flights back to England and a warm bed. They lived in tents next to their planes. They ate dust. They flew until their eyes burned and their hands shook. For the German soldier on the ground, the world shrank. The sky, once a source of light, became a source of terror. A German tank destroyer crewman near St. Lay described the experience. They were preparing for a counterattack, engines idling, morale high. Then came the sound, that distinctive, throaty growl. "We got scared," he wrote. "We heard them before we saw them." Radio intercepts picked up the American pilots chatting coolly, picking out targets like shoppers in a market. "I see M rolling in." There were 12 Thunderbolts. They set up a racetrack pattern in the sky, a continuous, circling conveyor belt of death. The first plane dove, guns blazing, tracers ripping up the earth. It dropped a 500-pound bomb. As it pulled up, the second plane was already diving. Then the third. Then the fourth. It never stopped, the German soldier recalled. By the time the 12th plane finished, the first was back. They plastered the whole area. The counterattack evaporated. The panzers were scrap metal. The men were gone. The Germans developed a dark humor to cope. They had a saying about identifying aircraft. If the plane is camouflaged, it's British. If it's silver, it's American. If it's invisible, that's the Luftwaffe. By the summer of 1944, the concept of air superiority had become a grim reality on the ground. The Luftwaffe had been swept from the sky. The German army was naked. They coined a new word for their fate. Death by fighter-bomber. It wasn't a clean death. A .50 caliber round doesn't make a neat hole. It tears a body apart. Napalm doesn't just burn. It clings and suffers. The psychological toll was immense. German generals, proud, aristocratic men who had conquered Europe, were being hunted like rabbits. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps, killed on the road. General Heinz Helmich, killed. General Wilhelm Falle, ambushed. The leadership was being decapitated from the air. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of all German forces in the West, was eventually captured. He told his interrogators the simple, humiliating truth. We could not move a single railroad train across the Rhine in daylight. He was exaggerating, but only slightly. To move by day was suicide. The German war machine, built on speed and blitzkrieg, was forced to crawl at night, hiding in forests, terrified of the sunrise. But the crescendo of destruction was yet to come. July 29, 1944. Operation Kobroth, American breakout, was in full swing. Near the village of Roncy, a massive column of German armor and infantry found itself trapped, squeezed between the American 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions. They had nowhere to go. The 405th Fighter Group spotted them. It was 3:10 in the afternoon. The sun was high. The targets were exposed. For the next 6.5 hours, the Thunderbolts did not stop. It was a slaughter. Wave after wave of P-47s rolled in. They dropped bombs until they were empty. They fired rockets until the tubes were scorched. They strafed until the barrels of their machine guns glowed red hot. The Germans had no flak coverage, no air support. They were fish in a barrel. When American ground troops finally advanced to inspect the aftermath, they fell silent. The scene was apocalyptic. 66 tanks were gutted, their turrets blown off. 204 vehicles were twisted wrecks. 11 artillery pieces were smashed. But it was the human cost that was hardest to look at. The roads were choked, literally blocked, with a slurry of twisted metal, dead horses, and the shattered remains of hundreds of men. It was one of the single most devastating displays of tactical air power in the history of warfare, and still, the Germans tried to fight back. In August, Hitler, delusional and desperate, ordered a massive counterattack at Mortain. He threw his last panzer divisions at the Americans, hoping to cut them off. It was called Operation Lutich for a few hours. In the mist, it looked like it might work. But then the sun came out. On August 7th, the clouds parted and the Thunderbolts descended. The panzers, concentrated for the attack, were clustered together. They were perfect targets. Within 24 hours, the offensive was broken. The hunters became the hunted. The German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army began to retreat. But the trap was closing. They were herded into a pocket near the town of Falla. This would become known as the Corridor of Death. 50,000 German soldiers were squeezed into a shrinking cauldron. The roads leading east were the only way out. And the Thunderbolts were waiting. German accounts from Falaise read like horror stories. They called the sky over the pocket a Joberenstreck, a fighter-bomber racecourse. There was never a moment of silence. The drone of the R2800 engines was the soundtrack of their destruction. A German corporal wrote, "The Jabos were a burden on our souls. We went mad. Men abandoned their vehicles and ran into the woods. Horses, terrified by the noise, stampeded through the columns. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man who had seen the carnage of World War I trenches, toured the battlefield at Falaise 2 days after the gap closed. What he saw shook him to his core. It was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of the war," Eisenhower wrote. "I walked for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The stench was so overpowering that pilots, flying hundreds of feet overhead, claimed they could smell the battlefield. From their cockpits, the German army in the West had been gutted. They lost 60,000 men, in the pocket 10,000 dead, 50,000 captured. The roads were museums of destruction, miles of blackened tanks and trucks that would rust in the French rain for decades. As the Allied armies raced toward the German border, the P-47s ranged ahead, clearing the path in September 1944. A column of 20,000 German troops surrendered to the Americans. They hadn't been beaten by a ground assault. They surrendered because of the air attacks. The psychological pressure of the constant, unending bombardment from the sky had broken their will to fight. It was a rare moment in history, an army surrendering to airplanes. But the war was not over. Winter was coming. In December 1944, Hitler rolled the dice one last time. He launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. He timed it perfectly. The weather was atrocious. Fog, snow, and low clouds grounded the Allied air forces. For days, the Germans advanced under the cover of the grey sky. American troops, shivering in foxholes, listened to the sound of panzers grinding forward, praying for the weather to break. Then, on December 23rd, the skies cleared. The blue returned, and with the blue sky came the roar. Major John Motzenbecker of the Hellhawks led his flight over the snow-covered hills near Bastogne. The landscape was white and pristine, the pine forests dark green. And there, stark against the snow, was the German army. They were jammed onto the narrow roads, a snake of steel stretching for miles. Traffic jams of tanks, supply trucks, and horse-drawn wagons. Motzenbecker couldn't believe his eyes. It was a target-rich environment beyond a pilot's wildest dreams. Intricate, he radioed. Going down. The slaughter that followed effectively ended the German offensive. In a single day, Motzenbecker's squadron and the rest of the group decimated the column. Over 100 vehicles destroyed. The roads became impassable walls of fire. The German advance didn't just stall. It died in the snow. The pilots were relentless. First Lieutenant Leslie Bowes, another Hellhawk, was already a legend. He had taken a bullet to the header gash in his skull from a shattered canopy and kept flying. He had survived a direct hit from an 88mm flak shell that shredded his wing. He would walk away from 4 different wrecked Thunderbolts by the end of the war. He named them all Blonde Trouble. Bowes and men like him flew until the very end. They flew because they knew what their presence meant to the infantry below. When the GIs in the freezing mud heard that radial engine roar, they stood up and cheered. They loved that ugly, fat plane. They loved it because when the jug was overhead, the Germans kept their heads down. The bond between the grunt on the ground and the pilot in the sky was forged in iron, and blood. The Germans had one card left to play. On New Year's Day, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, Desperate, massive surprise attack on Allied airfields. They came in low over the frozen fields of Belgium and the Netherlands, skimming the treetops to stay under the Allied radar screens. Nearly 1,000 German fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, roared across the dawn sky in a synchronized wave of violence. It was the largest single concentration of German air power since the Battle of Britain, a final, titanic gamble to shatter the Allied tactical air forces on the ground. At airfields like Metz, Brussels, and Eindhoven, American pilots and ground crews were waking up to a hangover of winter cold and New Year's fatigue. They were caught completely unaware. The first warning was the stutter of machine guns, and the tearing sound of cannon fire ripping through canvas tents and aluminum skin. Parked P-47s, sitting in neat rows awaiting their morning maintenance, erupted into fireballs. Fuel trucks exploded. sending geysers of burning gasoline into the grey sky. For a terrifying hour, the Luftwaffe owned the air again. They strafed the flight lines, destroying over 200 Allied aircraft, while they sat helpless on the tarmac. But as the smoke began to drift across the cratered runways, the terrible arithmetic of attrition revealed itself. The victory was a mirage. It was a hollow triumph that would break the Luftwaffe's back forever, while the Americans lost machines, metal, and rubber that could be replaced by the limitless industrial might of Detroit and Long Island within weeks. The Germans lost men. In their zeal to destroy the Allied Air Force, the Luftwaffe had flown into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and encountered scrambling Allied fighters. They lost nearly 300 aircraft. Worse, they lost over 200 highly experienced pilots, including veteran unit commanders who could never be replaced. The P-47 factories in the United States were churning out Thunderbolts faster than the Germans could shoot them down. But Germany had no more pilots, no more fuel, and no more time. Operation Bodenplatte was not a comeback. It was a suicide note written in aluminum and blood after the Battle of the Bulge and the failure of Bodenplatte. The German resistance in the West collapsed into a fighting retreat. But retreat implies an organized movement. What happened in the spring of 1945 was a dismantling. The Thunderbolts were no longer just supporting an advance. They were executing a systematic destruction of the German state's ability to function. The P-47s ranged far ahead of the Allied armies, roaming the skies over the German heartland with absolute impunity. They hunted everything. A single German soldier on a bicycle was considered a valid target. A staff car moving between villages was a death sentence. The statistics from these final months are so vast they become almost abstract, but each number represents a violent, kinetic event. Between D-Day and Victory in Europe Day, Thunderbolt pilots claimed the destruction of 86,000 railroad cars. Think of the scale of that. That is an entire nation's logistics system reduced to twisted steel and burning wood. They destroyed 9,000 locomotives, leaving the German economy paralyzed, unable to move coal, food, or ammunition. They smashed 6,000 armored vehicles and 68,000 trucks. In total, the pilots flew nearly 550,000 combat sorties. The sheer relentless pressure of it is hard to comprehend. It was a conveyor belt of aerial violence that never stopped. Day or night, and in the air, the flying bathtub settled the score with its critics once and for all. The plane that Luftwaffe pilots had mocked as a milk jug ended the war with an aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1. For every Thunderbolt lost in combat, nearly 5 German aircraft were swatted out of the sky. The loyalty this aircraft inspired was fierce, bordering on the religious. The 56th Fighter Group, Hub Zemke's famous Wolfpack, was the only unit in the majestic 8th Air Force that refused to upgrade. When other groups traded their P-47s for the faster, longer-ranged P-51 Mustangs, the Wolfpack pilots dug in their heels. They didn't want the Mustang. They knew the Mustang was fragile, that a single lucky shot to its liquid cooling system would bring it down. They wanted the jug. They wanted the armor. They wanted the ability to plow through a brick wall and keep flying. They flew their P-47s until the final day of the war, racking up 677 aerial victories and 311 ground than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force. They paid for that record with 128 aircraft lost, but they saved countless lives in the process. The men who flew these machines became legends. Their stories woven into the fabric of American military history. Francis Gabby Gabreski, a Polish American from Oil City, Pennsylvania, became the top American ace in the European theater. He had flown with the Wolfpack, using the P-47's diving speed to slash through German formations. He racked up 28 kills. But the war had a way of humbling even the best. In July 1944, hungry for one last kill on the ground, Gabreski flew to low. His propeller tips clipped a rise in the terrain. He crash-landed in a wheat field near Koblenz and spent the rest of the war in a prison camp, Hubzem, the tactician who taught them how to fight. Also ended the war behind barbed wire after his P-51 broke apart in turbulence during a mission later in the war. But it was the story of Glenn Duncan that perhaps best illustrated the spirit of the Thunderbolt pilots. Duncan, the Texan who had pioneered the on-the-deck strafing tactics, vanished on July 7, 1944. He was leading a raid against an airfield in Germany when 88mm flak tore into his aircraft. His wingman saw his plane go down. They saw the explosion. They wrote him off as dead, another casualty of the brutal ground attack mission. But Duncan wasn't dead. He had belly-landed his broken Thunderbolt in a field near Nice. As German troops raced toward the crash site, Duncan scrambled out of the cockpit. He didn't run immediately. He pulled the pin on an incendiary grenade and tossed it into the cockpit, destroying the instruments and the sensitive radio gear. He would not let the enemy have his prize. Then he ran. For 10 months, Glenn Duncan was a ghost. He walked across occupied Europe, moving by night, hiding in barns and cellars. He made contact with the Dutch resistance, living among them, hiding in plain sight under the noses of the Gestapo. He refused to surrender. In April 1945, when Allied forces finally liberated the area, a ragged figure walked out to meet them. It was Duncan. He returned to his unit, not just alive, but ready to take command of the 353rd Fighter Group again. He was unbreakable, just like his airplane back in the United States. The impact of the Thunderbolt went beyond the battlefield. Republic Aviation on Long Island had become a titan of industry. The factory floors were a symphony of riveting guns and heavy machinery, producing more than 15,600 Thunderbolts by the time the line shut down. It was the most produced American fighter of the war. Alexander Kurtvelli, the visionary immigrant who had designed the dinosaur, never sought the limelight. While other designers became celebrities, Kurtvelli quietly continued to shape the future. He understood that the age of the propeller was ending. He took the DNA of the Thunderbolt, the philosophy of speed, durability, and massive firepower, and translated it into the jet age. He designed the F-84 Thunderjet and the F-105 Thunderjet, the Thud that would bear the brunt of the air war over Vietnam. But his most lasting legacy might be a plane he didn't design, but which was born from his philosophy decades later, when the United States Air Force needed a new dedicated ground attack aircrafter plane that could fly low, absorb punishment, and destroy tanks. They looked back at history. They built a plane that was ugly, slow, and heavily armored. They built a plane around a massive gun, just as Kurtvelli had built his plane around a massive engine. They named it the A-10 Thunderbolt II, but the pilots, honoring the lineage of the P-47, simply called it the Warthog. The spirit of the Jug lives on in every mission the A-10 flies today, as the war in Europe ground to its halt in May 1945. The silence that fell over the continent was deafening. The roar of the R-2800 engines finally faded. Bob Johnson, the boy from Oklahoma who had survived the impossible, came home. He went to work for Republic Aviation, using his combat experience to help design better, safer cockpits for the next generation of pilots. He spent 18 years with the company before moving into insurance. But he never stopped telling the story. Until his death in 1998, he traveled to schools and air shows, talking to young people about the war. He didn't glorify the killing. He talked about the machine. He talked about the engineering that brought him home when he should have died. For the German veterans, the memories were different. The trauma of the Jabot attacks left deep psychological scars. Years after the war, men who had served in Normandy or the Ardennes would instinctively flinch at the sound of a low-flying Piper Cub or a crop duster. The sound of an engine overhead triggered a primal fear response that peacetime could not erase. One German officer, captured in the ruins of the Ruhr pocket, summed up the total domination of the Thunderbolt. "We could not move," he told his captors, his voice thick with resignation. "We could not bring up supplies. We could not even bury our dead. The Jabots saw everything. They were everywhere." Even the skeptics were converted. Major Joseph Priller, the Luftwaffe ace, who had laughed at the barrel in 1943, changed his tune. By 1945, he had seen his squadron decimated by the American heavyweights. It was the perfect fighter bomber, he admitted later. Its guns never jammed. It never overheated. We laughed at it once. We were not laughing at the end. But for the American infantrymen, the GI shivering in a foxhole in the Hurtgen forest or marching across the plains of Germany, the P-47 was not a machine of terror. It was an angel of mercy. Veterans of the ground war speak of the Thunderbolt with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons. They remember the moments when they were pinned down, when German tanks were cresting the hill, when hope was gone. And then they remember the sound. The deep, chest-vibrating rumble of the double Wasp engine. They would look up and see the silver shapes diving out of the sun. They would see the rockets streak away, leaving trails of white smoke. They would feel the ground shake as the bombs impacted. And they would know that they were going to live another day. "I loved that big, ugly bird," one infantry veteran recalled, tears standing in his eyes 50 years later. "It was the most beautiful thing I ever saw." Today, the physical remnants of this saga are rare. Most of the 15,000 Thunderbolts were scrapped, melted down to build toasters and cars for the post-war boom. But a few survived. In museums like the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum or the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, you can still see them. They sit silently now, their silver skins polished, their guns cold. But if you stand next to one, you are struck by the sheer physical presence of the machine. It is immense. It radiates a sense of brute force that photographs cannot capture at air shows. A handful of restored Thunderbolts still fly. When the pilot fires up that 18-cylinder radial engine, the crowd goes silent. It coughs, spits blue smoke, and then settles into that distinctive, heavy idula sound like a bucket of bolts being shaken by a giant dot as it takes off, pulling into the sky with that familiar, aggressive climbing turn. You can almost see the ghosts of 1944. You can imagine the hedgerows of Normandy, the snow of the Bulge, the desperate roads of the Falaise pocket. The pilots who flew them are almost all gone now. The 56th Fighter Group Association and the Hellhawks Association held their reunions for decades. They met in hotel ballrooms, graying men with hearing aids and walking sticks. They drank toasts to the jug, They remembered the friends who didn't come back. Tom Glenn, a P-47 pilot, who later became an author, captured the complexity of their war. He recalled the terrible, sickening feeling of strafing those horse-drawn columns in the final weeks of the war. "The horses were not our enemy," he said softly, "but war is a machine that demands terrible choices. We had to stop the column. We had to save our own troops." It was a reminder that even the good war was a tragedy of blood and iron. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not just in the kill counts or the tonnage of bombs dropped. It is in the doctrine of modern warfare, the lessons learned in the skies over France, the integration of air and ground forces. The concept of close air support shapes the way militaries fight to this day. Every time an A-10 Warthog rolls in to support troops in the desert, it is following a path blazed by Glenn, Duncan, Arlo, Henry, and the boys of the Hellhawks. They proved that air power wasn't just about strategic bombing of factories hundreds of miles away. They proved it was about the dirt, the mud, and the few hundred yards of ground directly in front of the infantry. The Thunderbolt was a dinosaur, yes, but it was the dinosaur that ruled the earth. If this story of the P-47 Thunderbolt and the men who flew it moved you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us keep these memories alive, ensuring that the sacrifices of the greatest generation are never forgotten. Subscribe to the channel for more immersive histories from the Second World War. We want to tell the stories that aren't in the textbooks, the stories of the machines and the people who changed the world. And we want to hear from you. Did a relative of yours fly the Jug? Did your grandfather serve in the infantry and see them overhead? Leave a comment below. Share your connection to this history. These stories belong to all of us. Thank you for watching.